History remembers the giants. Eisenhower, who held an alliance together through sheer force of will. Zhukov, who broke the Wehrmacht at Kursk and never stopped. Slim, who rebuilt a shattered army in the jungle and destroyed 3 Japanese divisions. Manstein, who pulled off the most audacious operational maneuver of the modern era. But for every genius who shaped the war, there was a commander who changed it in the other direction. 7 generals from 7 different armies proved that incompetence, cowardice, and catastrophic ego wear stars in every language. 7 men whose decisions didn't just lose battles, they extended the war. They filled prisoner of war camps. They sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers into situations no amount of courage could save them from. This is the definitive ranking of the 7 worst generals of the entire Second World War. Number 7 starved his own army inside a frozen pocket because he couldn't admit the obvious. Number 1 surrendered more soldiers in a single afternoon than most generals ever commanded. These men didn't just fail. They failed on a scale that altered nations, collapsed empires, and condemned millions to suffering that competent leadership would have prevented. Number 7. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the general who obeyed an order that killed 300,000 men. On the 31st of January, 1943, a German field marshal surrendered to a Soviet army for the first time in history. Friedrich Paulus sat in the basement of a ruined Stalingrad department store and handed his pistol to Soviet Lieutenant General Mikhail Shumilov. Outside, the remnants of the German Sixth Army, 91,000 frostbitten, starving survivors of what had once been 300,000 men, emerged from the rubble with their hands raised. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal the day before. It was a deliberate signal. No German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. The promotion was an order to commit suicide rather than surrender. Paulus chose surrender. Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus was born in Hesse-Nassau in 1890. A superb staff officer, meticulous, intelligent, and utterly without the moral architecture required to defy Adolf Hitler. He rose through the Wehrmacht as the ideal subordinate, thorough, obedient, technically brilliant. By 1942, he commanded the Sixth Army, the most powerful single-field army in the German order of battle. Operation Blue assigned Paulus the task of capturing Stalingrad, while Army Group A drove into the Caucasus for oil. The city became an obsession for Hitler because it bore Stalin's name. What should have been a strategic flank guard became the main effort. Paulus allowed it to happen. Through the brutal urban fighting of summer and autumn 1942, Paulus fed his army into the ruins, building by building, floor by floor. His staff warned him his northern flank was catastrophically exposed, defended by understrength Romanian and Italian armies. Soviet forces were massing there. The intelligence was accurate. Paulus forwarded it to Hitler's headquarters and accepted the reassurances he received in return. On the 19th of November 1942, Operation Uranus closed. Soviet pincers met at Kalak, encircling the entire Sixth Army. What followed is where Paulus's failure reaches its fullest dimension. His army could not be supplied by air. Gring promised it. Everyone who understood air logistics knew it was impossible. The Sixth Army needed 750 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 94. Men froze. Men starved. The temperature dropped to -40. Paulus had the authority to attempt a breakout. Manstein launched Operation Winterstorm specifically to reach him from outside. When the relief spearhead got within 35 miles of the pocket, Paulus refused to move without Hitler's explicit permission to abandon Stalingrad. Hitler refused. Paulus obeyed. He was not a coward in the physical sense. He was a coward in the only sense that matters for a commander. When the lives of his men required him to defy illegitimate authority, he could not do it. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. Paulus died in 1957 in East Germany, having spent his final years giving lectures for the Soviets. The men of the Sixth Army were still dying in prisoner of war camps when he made his peace with history. Number 6. General Mark Clark, the general who let the Germans escape to win a photo opportunity. In May 1944, the Allied armies in Italy had Germany's 10th Army in a trap that could have ended the Italian campaign 6 months early. The Anzio breakout was working. General Lucien Truscott's 6th Corps was driving northeast, positioned to cut Highway 6 at Valmontone, sealing the only German escape route. Kesselring was desperate. Then Mark Clark changed the orders. On the 25th of May, with the trap nearly closed, Clark redirected the main effort. Instead of Valmontone, 6th Corps would turn northwest toward Rome. Clark wanted to be the first general to capture Rome. He wanted the photographs. He did not want the British sharing the glory. Kesselring's 10th Army escaped through the gap Clark had opened. The German retreat that should have been a rout became an orderly withdrawal to the Gothic line. The Italian campaign, which Clark's decision might have concluded in 1944, continued until May 1945. Truscott was furious, writing later that the opportunity had been lost for personal vanity. Clark got his photographs. He entered Rome on the 5th of June 1944. The next morning, the Normandy landings dominated every headline on Earth, and Rome vanished from the front pages. His vanity had cost thousands of lives and extended a campaign by a year, and he didn't even get to enjoy the publicity. Mark Wayne Clark was born in New York in 1896. Youngest lieutenant general in American history, a genuinely talented planner, but possessed of a vanity so consuming it functioned as a separate tactical liability. His subordinates, including Truscott and his British counterparts, came to despise him. His operational record beyond Rome invites sustained criticism. The Italian campaign under Clark was characterized by frontal assaults against prepared German positions in mountainous terrain that negated Allied superiority in armor and air. Monte Cassino was attacked 4 times at a cost of more than 55,000 Allied casualties. His relationship with his British coalition partners was permanently poisoned by his habit of undermining their decisions and withholding cooperation. He died in 1984 at age 87 and wrote memoirs defending every decision. The German 10th Army that escaped through the Valmontone Gap fought on for 11 more months. The men who died fighting it deserved better than a general who chose a photograph over a victory. Number 5. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, the general whose cavalry charges belonged in a different century. In September 1941, the largest encirclement in the history of warfare closed around Kiev. 4 Soviet armies, over 600,000 men, were surrounded, captured, or killed. The architect of that catastrophe on the Soviet side was Semyon Budyonny, commander of the Southwestern Front. Budyonny had been warned. His own chief of staff, Tupikov, sent Moscow a message on the 14th of September, describing the situation with unflinching clarity. Tupikov was reprimanded for defeatism. Budyonny himself had recommended withdrawal from Kiev weeks earlier and been overruled by Stalin. When the encirclement closed on the 19th of September, his warning was vindicated in the most catastrophic way possible. This is where Budyonny's defenders make their argument. He saw the danger and said so. Stalin overruled him. The argument fails on examination. Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny was born in 1883, the son of a Cossack peasant, and rose to become one of the Red Army's most celebrated commanders. His reputation rested entirely on the Russian Civil War, where his 1st Cavalry Army had ridden, slashed, and burned its way through the fighting of the 1920s. He was a brilliant cavalry commander of that era. By 1941, his entire conception of warfare had been rendered obsolete by the internal combustion engine. He was one of Stalin's closest military allies, a founding member of the political military establishment that survived the purges by never threatening Stalin's authority. He had enthusiastically supported those same purges that gutted the Red Army's professional officer corps, men far more capable than he was, because they elevated him. The Soviet armies that faced Germany in 1941 were commanded disproportionately by political loyalists and decimated disproportionately as a result. He was relieved after Kiev and given the reserve front, which also performed disastrously, before being shuffled into ceremonial roles where his Civil War reputation could be displayed without operational consequence. He lived until 1973, dying at 90, festooned with medals and never held accountable. The 600,000 men lost at Kiev constitute the largest military encirclement in recorded history. Budyonny commanded the front that suffered it and spent the preceding years helping build the system that made it possible. Number 4. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the general who starved 3 divisions to feed his ego. In March 1944, Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation U-Go, an offensive into northeast India aimed at capturing the British supply hub at Imphal. He committed 3 divisions, approximately 85,000 men, into the Burmese hills with 17 days of supplies, and the unshakable belief that his army would sustain itself by capturing British food and ammunition as it advanced. The British did not cooperate with this plan. What followed was the largest land defeat in Japanese military history. At Imphal and Kohima, British and Indian forces under General Slim stopped the Japanese offensive, counterattacked, and pursued the remnants back through the jungle. Of the 85,000 men Mutaguchi committed, more than 53,000 were killed, wounded, or died of disease and starvation. The retreat became known in Japanese accounts simply as the Road of Bones. Renya Mutaguchi was born in 1888 and embodied the most dangerous qualities of the Imperial Japanese Army's officer culture. Personal bravery elevated into doctrine, willpower treated as a substitute for logistics, and contempt for subordinates who raised practical objections. His planning for Operation U-Go was an act of magical thinking, documented in his own staff records. His divisional commanders told him to his face the plan would fail. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, tasked with capturing Kohima, warned explicitly his division could not sustain itself on the supplies allocated. He was ignored. Lieutenant General Masafumi Yamauchi of the 15th Division made the same warnings. Also ignored, Mutaguchi's response to deteriorating conditions was to sack all 3 divisional commanders during the battle itself, replacing men who reported reality with men who might report something more acceptable. Sato, watching his division disintegrate without resupply, eventually ordered his own withdrawal without permission. His men at least survived to retreat. Those who obeyed Mutaguchi's orders to keep attacking until ammunition was gone and men were eating roots had no such option. Mutaguchi was relieved in August 1944. He outlived most of his men, dying in 1966 at 77, and spent his final years writing memoirs blaming his subordinates. The bones left in the Burmese jungle offered no rebuttal. Number 3. General Maurice Gamelin, the general who lost France in 6 weeks. On the 14th of May 1940, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned Churchill and said words Churchill remembered for the rest of his life. "We have been defeated." Churchill refused to believe it. He flew to Paris and asked Gamelin where the strategic reserve was, the mass of French armor held back to counterattack any German breakthrough. Gamelin said, in French, "There is none." Churchill later wrote that he was stupefied. The greatest army in Europe had been committed entirely into the teeth of a German operational maneuver, with nothing held in reserve. Maurice Gustave Gamelin was born in Paris in 1872. He was a genuinely brilliant staff officer, Joffre's primary planner in the First World War, and architect of the Marne counteroffensive that saved France in 1914. He was sophisticated, intellectual, politically adroit, and by 1940 approximately 3 decades past his operational peak. Gamelin commanded the Allied forces in France from an underground headquarters at Vincennes that had no radio. He communicated with his armies by telephone and motorcycle messenger, adding hours of delay to every decision in a campaign where the German decision cycle measured in hours. His catastrophic strategic error was Plan D. the decision to send the best Allied divisions north into Belgium, to meet a German advance he expected through the Belgian plain. This was logical. It was exactly what the Germans wanted him to do. The actual main effort came through the Ardennes, which Gamelin had declared difficult terrain unsuitable for armored advance, lightly defended by second-rate divisions. 7 panzer divisions poured through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse in under 2 days, and drove for the English Channel, cutting off every Allied army that had advanced into Belgium. The strategic reserve that might have counterattacked did not exist because Gamelin had committed everything forward. When informed that German armor was crossing the Meuse at Sedan, Gamelin told his staff the battle was lost. He made no decisive intervention. He waited. Churchill replaced him with General Weygand, but the damage was done. Dunkirk saved the British army. France fell. 1.8 million French soldiers went into captivity. Gamelin was arrested by Vichy, tried, and spent the war imprisoned, eventually in Schloss-Itter in the Austrian Tyrol. He was liberated in 1945 and died in 1958 at 86. The soldiers who spent 5 years in German prisoner of war camps went there because their supreme commander could not adapt his First World War mind to a Second World War battlefield. Number 2. General Lloyd Fredendall, the general who built a bunker while his men died. 40,000 American soldiers were fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia. Their commanding general was 70 miles behind the front, in an underground bunker, asking his engineers to make his private quarters more comfortable. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the Second Corps. His soldiers were dying at Kasserine Pass, in America's worst defeat of the European War. Fredendall was worried about whether his shelter had adequate anti-aircraft defenses. He had spent 3 weeks ordering an entire engineer battalion to blast tunnels into a ravine wall to build it. He issued orders in a personal slang code nobody could decipher. He refused to visit his own troops. The result was 6,500 American casualties, 4,000 captured, and a line that collapsed 50 miles deep. Lloyd Ralston Fredendall was born in Wyoming in 1883. He failed out of West Point twice. By some process that remains a source of bafflement to military historians, General George Marshall identified him as one of the best officers in the Army and recommended him to Eisenhower for a major combat command. Fredendall's tunnel complex required 200 engineers working 3 weeks of continuous shifts, built while those same engineers might have been preparing the positions his corps would need when the Germans attacked. He never visited the front. He never saw the terrain his soldiers were defending. His orders were literally incomprehensible. One documented order read, "Move your command," i.e. the walking boys, pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's. Commanders at the front spent precious time trying to decode it. Some never did. When German forces struck at Sidi Bouzid on the 14th of February 1943, and Rommel seized control of the broader offensive 5 days later at Kasserine Pass itself, Fredendall fed reinforcements into the collapsing battle piecemeal, 1 unit at a time. German armor destroyed them individually. By the 20th of February, the line had broken across a front 50 miles deep. Eisenhower relieved him. Patton took command of the Second Corps on the 6th of March, and within 10 days had restored discipline and morale. The army Fredendall had demoralized was capable of fighting. It had simply needed a commander capable of leading it. Fredendall was sent home, promoted to lieutenant general, and given a training command where his appetite for personal comfort could do no operational harm. He retired in 1946 and died in 1963 at 79. Military historians rank him without serious debate as the worst American general of the war. The 6,500 Americans who became casualties at Kasserine deserved a commander who had at minimum seen the ground they were dying on. Number 1. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the general who surrendered an empire. On the 15th of February, 1942, a tall, thin British general walked toward Japanese lines at Bukit-Timah, carrying a white flag. One of his staff officers carried a Union Jack, in case anyone missed the point. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival was walking to surrender 85,000 soldiers, the largest capitulation in British military history, to a Japanese force of 36,000 men, who were running out of ammunition, water, and food. Lieutenant General Yamashita, receiving the surrender, had privately feared for days that the British might counterattack and overwhelm him. He had been bluffing with an empty hand. His opponent folded. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Arthur Ernest Percival was born in Hertfordshire in 1887. Brave in the personal sense, decorated in the First World War and in Ireland, intelligent and well-read. One of the most catastrophically mismatched commanders to a command in the entire war. He was warned that Japanese forces in Indochina were jungle warfare specialists, trained for exactly the campaign that was coming. He had 100,000 men, and did not use the months before December 1941 to train them for the terrain, prepare demolitions along the peninsula's roads, or build the defensive positions that might have slowed what was coming. He explicitly rejected proposals to fortify Singapore Island's northern shore, telling subordinates it would damage civilian morale. When Yamashita's forces crossed the Johor Strait on the night of the 8th of February 1942, those undefended beaches fell in hours. Within 48 hours, Japanese forces controlled the island's water reservoirs. His campaign down the Malayan Peninsula was 550 miles of retreat in 55 days. The British force told it was defending an impregnable position discovered instead that its commander had no coherent plan for the depth or pace of the Japanese advance. On the afternoon of the 15th of February, Percival gathered his senior commanders. Brigadier Ivan Simpson told him the Japanese were desperately short of supplies. General Gordon Bennett believed a counterattack was possible. The garrison still had 85,000 men. Ammunition was critically low in some sectors, but not exhausted everywhere. Percival decided to surrender. Yamashita was in a hurry. He later admitted he feared protracted negotiation because his own situation was desperate. He demanded a simple yes or no. Percival gave him yes. 85,000 men went into captivity. Thousands died on the Sandakan death marches. Thousands died building the Burma-Thailand Railway. Thousands more died of disease and brutality in camps across Asia. A significant proportion never came home. MacArthur arranged for him to attend the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri. Military historians have not been as rehabilitating as that gesture implied. He died in 1966 at 78. His defenders argue he faced impossible odds, was given inadequate forces, and was let down by London. All of these things contain truth. None of them explain why a Japanese force of 36,000, running out of ammunition, received the surrender of 85,000 men, who still had the physical capacity to fight. Arthur Percival did not lose Singapore because the odds were impossible. He lost it because when his opponent bluffed with an empty hand, he could not see it. 85,000 soldiers paid for that blindness. 7 generals, 7 armies, 7 catastrophic failures measured not in battles lost, but in lives destroyed, campaigns prolonged, and opportunities surrendered to enemies who should never have received them. Paulus obeyed when his men needed him to defy. Clark chose a photograph over a victory. Budyonny helped purge an officer corps of men better than himself, then proved they were better than him. Mutaguchi fed 3 divisions into the jungle on willpower and fantasy, and left their bones there. Gamelin marched the finest Allied army into a trap, with no reserve and nothing to do when it closed. Fredendall built a bunker 70 miles behind his dying men, and decorated it. Percival surrendered an empire to a general who was bluffing. Their armies deserved better. The soldiers who served under them deserved better. History has given them what they gave their men: the unadorned truth.